Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone around the world. I am Asia El Guasem, the acting head of the Tax and Environment Unit at the Tax Policy and Statistics Division of the Center for Tax Policy Administration of the OECD. Thank you very much for joining us virtually for a very important discussion. This session that we called New Realities of Carbon Pricing, Implications for Developing Countries, is an opportunity for us to share insights from the work conducted by the OECD and our partner organization, in this case, the Asian Development Bank, in the area of carbon pricing, and to hear from you for an interactive and engaging discussion. Voilà. So, just to give you a brief outline of what we're going to discuss today. So we're going to start with the part where we're going to discuss the latest trends and developments in carbon pricing. This includes discussing the context in which we are today in terms of climate action. More broadly, then Anasuya will join me to discuss the main findings from our latest ECR report. And then with a particular focus on developing countries and emerging economies. We will also be discussing a recent OECD initiative, the Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches, and looking forward, looking at new developments and trying to anticipate their implications on carbon pricing. So to begin, the context in which we're in, we see that from projections on the emissions pathways under different scenarios, we see that our current policies and policy landscape on climate is not going to allow us to reach our net zero emissions goals. So there is a significant gap between what our stated policies would lead to in terms of emissions outcomes by mid-century and where we need to end up to for the net zero goals. And even so, with the announced pledges that countries have put forward, there is a significant implementation gap. So there is a need to follow through with the announced pledges, and that is still going to not allow us to reach our net zero emissions. So there's going to be a need for greater effort to close this ambition gap, and which means that countries will have to really look deeply into the climate mitigation policy toolbox, which spans a wide range of instruments, and try to deploy these policies in order to achieve the goals. What we see already is that current policy settings vary greatly, and this is understandable as these differences reflect the complexity in country circumstances, their climate ambitions, their pre-existing conditions, their political constraints, and social differences. And this diversity translates into policy packages, both of policies that were introduced explicitly to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and others that were introduced for other reasons, like revenue-raising objectives, but could still have significant impacts on emission outcomes. We also see that current policy packages are both market and non-market based, so including standards and regulations, but also carbon pricing measures that we will be diving into today. And these policies, while they are meant to decrease emissions, they do have implications, economic and otherwise, as they increase compliance costs for firms, or in the case of subsidies for low carbon technologies, they decrease these costs, but of course come at the expense of greater fiscal burdens. Nevertheless, in the policy toolbox, carbon pricing plays a very important role, and it remains as a core mitigation instrument for many countries. And the reason why, because there are several merits to carbon pricing, including that it does reduce emissions effectively. It offers flexibility so that it leads to emissions reductions at least cost, because firms and households can choose the least cost options for reducing emissions. By providing strong carbon pricing signals, carbon pricing also steers investment and innovation towards low carbon alternatives. That it increases the business case for investing in low carbon assets. Unlike regulation, such as standards, carbon pricing provides ongoing incentives. We see that in regulation, once you meet a certain standard, you don't have the incentive to keep increasing your efficiency further, but carbon pricing allows for these incentives to persist over time. Another important element for carbon pricing, and this is something that goes along the lines of domestic revenue mobilization, is that carbon pricing raises revenues. And given that countries today are having additional fiscal pressures coming from several sources, I think this is a much appreciated feature of carbon pricing. Also, carbon pricing provides co-benefits, one notably reducing local air pollution, which can improve health outcomes, and this is, again, very important, especially in urban settings. But of course, when we have carbon pricing, it's important to align these instruments with the broader policy package, including its alignment with existing subsidies that can undermine its effectiveness. Of course, the distributional consequences of implementing carbon taxes warrant that carbon pricing should be accompanied with compensatory measures in order to offset the adverse effects on vulnerable populations. And with that, I turn the floor to Anasuya Raj, who will tell us more about the findings in our effective carbon rates report. Anasuya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Asia. So I now present our latest OECD effective carbon rates findings. Effective Carbon Rates 2023 report is the fourth edition of this work. It analyzes carbon prices on greenhouse gas emissions in 2021 across 72 economies, which include 45 OECD and G20 countries and an ever larger number of emerging economies. So these countries together account for approximately 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And the effective carbon rates indicator estimates carbon prices, which result from carbon taxes and emissions trading systems, so explicit carbon pricing instruments, as well as fuel excise taxes, an implicit carbon pricing instrument. Given the policy changes due to the energy crisis and inflation rates and high inflation rates, the report also tracks changes to real carbon prices to 2023. And in particular, it tracks the evolution of emissions trading systems permit prices, as well as fuel excise and carbon taxes in the road transport sector. But for the purpose of today's presentation, I won't discuss these findings. The effective carbon rates, or ECR indicator, takes a comprehensive view of carbon pricing, and its components may also be viewed through a lens of explicit and implicit carbon pricing, as mentioned in the previous slide. Because on the one hand, emissions trading systems and carbon taxes are instruments whose policy intention is to price greenhouse gas emissions, while fuel excise taxes are generally not implemented with this intention, but nevertheless have the end result of strongly affecting fossil fuel prices and hence carbon emissions. So in this database, we include pricing instruments that apply to a base that's strictly proportional to the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that result from using the fuel. And the policy instruments which are covered directly increase the cost of emitting greenhouse gases to stimulate a transition in production, consumption, and investment choices to low or zero carbon alternatives. So our database provides a breakdown of emissions and corresponding effective carbon rates for each country by sector, subsector, and fuel. So in the next slide, we actually see a breakdown by sector. So the figure in this slide shows greenhouse gas emissions on the horizontal axis and effective carbon rates on the vertical axis in 2021 over the 72 countries which are covered in the report. So the horizontal axis is broken down by sector with road and off-road transport, industry, electricity, agriculture and fisheries, and buildings, making up all CO2 emissions from energy use. And then emissions from other greenhouse gases, so this last category in the chart, are emissions from methane, nitrous oxide, F-gases, and CO2 from industrial processes. And so they're shown in a separate category. So emissions trading systems are shown in green and fuel excise taxes in light blue and carbon taxes in dark blue. So finally, to read this graph, the width of rectangles shows the amount of emissions which are covered by the pricing instruments, and their height shows the price level. So certain things that we can see from this chart is that in 2021, about 40%, so more precisely 42% of the approximately 40 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions were priced in the 72 countries covered in this report. And this comes with significant variations of coverage, prices, and pricing instruments across sectors and countries. So in this chart, we can see the variations across sectors. And what we can see is that carbon price signals mainly arise from fuel excise taxes, which cover more emissions and have higher rates than the two explicit carbon pricing instruments, so carbon taxes and emissions trading systems. But there is heterogeneity across countries and sectors. So in the road and off-road transport sectors and agriculture and fisheries sectors, fuel excise taxes account for over 80% of the effective carbon rate. Then carbon taxes tend to be more significant as a share of the effective carbon rate for the building sector, and electricity sector emissions are predominantly priced through emissions trading systems. Now, the share of greenhouse gas emissions, which are covered by carbon pricing, varies across sectors. And this ranges from only about 4% of other greenhouse gas emissions being priced to around 93% of emissions which are priced in the road transport sector. We can see that the non-CO2 emissions from energy use, so this other greenhouse gas category, which is the least priced category of emissions, can actually make up an important share of countries' emissions. So the graph, which is presented in this slide, shows the split of countries' greenhouse gas emissions between, in blue, CO2 emissions from energy use, and in red, other greenhouse gas emissions, so methane, nitrous oxide, F-gases, and CO2 from industrial processes. So we can see that other greenhouse gases make up more than 50% of domestic greenhouse gas emissions for 1/4 of the countries which are covered in the report. And they range from about 10% in countries' total greenhouse gas emissions, so in Japan, on the left-hand side, to about 90% in Ethiopia, as can be seen on the right-hand side. So if we move on to the next slide, we can take a closer look at what makes up the bulk of these other greenhouse gas emissions. The left-hand side of this, the left-hand side graph on the slide shows the sectoral composition of other greenhouse gas emissions, and the right-hand side chart presents the breakdown by greenhouse gas. So in most countries, in terms of sectors, non-energy related agricultural emissions make up the highest share of other greenhouse gas emissions. And in terms of gases, methane makes up the highest share of other greenhouse gas emissions. So one of the highlights of our report is that the importance that these other greenhouse gas emissions can have underscores the need to incorporate these emissions in designing pathways to net zero, but uncertainties in their measurement can make establishing the tax base for these emissions considerably harder than for CO2 emissions. So effectively addressing them is likely to require the consideration of mitigation policies that go beyond carbon taxes, which are primarily designed to address CO2 emissions from energy use. As I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, our database covers an increasing number of developing and emerging economies. Yes, so on this slide, we can see that they make up almost half of the countries which are covered in the report. So they represent 35 countries, and they present a variety in their economic developments, as can be seen in this table. We can see why it's important to consider carbon pricing in developing and emerging economies. So carbon pricing and energy taxation more generally are at the nexus of several United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. Carbon pricing straightforwardly contributes to SDG 13, so climate action. And by helping tackle local air pollution as well, it supports SDG 3, as Asia mentioned at the beginning, so good health and well-being. And with the right design, it can also help affordable and clean energy, so SDG 7, and lead to more sustainable cities and communities, SDG 11. So the reason for that is that on the one hand, carbon pricing can support domestic revenue mobilization. And on the other hand, it can also provide a clear signal to encourage cleaner investment and consumption choices for all public and private spending. So this is not only an effective and efficient way to reduce CO2 emissions, but it can also encourage the sustainability of investments. And what this can also do is that it can avoid many of the transaction costs that are actually facing the developed world today, such as stranded assets and stranded jobs. And it could even enable some countries to leapfrog the most polluting fossil fuels altogether. So what does our report say? We can see that today carbon pricing in developing countries mostly stems from fuel excise taxes. So this graph shows average effective carbon rates broken down by component, so by pricing instruments for countries and groups of countries. And what we can see is that most LDCs and lower middle income countries, if they price their greenhouse gas emissions, only do so through fuel excise taxes. And carbon taxes and emissions trading systems are starting to gain momentum for now, mostly in upper middle income countries. So on the next slide, we have some recent developments in these explicit carbon pricing instruments. Which can be seen throughout the world. So carbon taxes have been introduced in 2 Mexican states in 2023. The Mexico national ETS transitioned from its pilot phase to its operational phase in 2023. And Indonesia introduced an emissions trading system for coal power plants. Actually, so these are the ones that were implemented in 2023, but there's a momentum, which is, and these explicit pricing instruments are increasingly being discussed and considered in a number of developing and emerging economies, with planned implementation dates, which are already settled for Bosnia and Herzegovina, Colombia, Turkey, and Vietnam. Voluntary carbon markets are also gaining momentum with an increasing number of initiatives in developing countries. So, for example, the Egyptian Exchange announced the launch of the Pan-African voluntary carbon market in December last year. So let me end the section with a brief note on how pricing CO2 emissions from energy use can be relatively straightforward. So since almost all countries have experience with fuel excise taxes, the implementation of carbon price reform is within reach from an administrative point of view, at least. So in order to introduce carbon taxes, government could align excise taxes with the carbon content of the fuel. So what this table shows is that, for instance, a carbon tax of 30 euro per ton of CO2 corresponds to a gasoline tax of 6.9 euro cents per liter of gasoline, or a tax on diesel of about 8 euro cents per liter of diesel. So these fuel-based carbon taxes can then be collected from the fuel suppliers in the same way as existing excise taxes. But carbon pricing can face other barriers, such as equity and affordability concerns, political acceptability, and it's not the only climate mitigation tool and is often part of a larger portfolio of climate and fiscal policies. And also, as mentioned previously, carbon pricing may not be the best suited tool to tackle greenhouse gas emissions, which are not CO2 emissions from energy use. So this now brings me to the IFCMA, the Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches, which goes beyond carbon pricing to consider a much broader range of climate mitigation policies. So the IFCMA had its first meeting in February last year, bringing together more than 600 senior officials and delegates from 104 countries and several international organizations. It's designed to help optimize the global impact of efforts in countries around the world to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by facilitating data and information sharing, enabling evidence-based mutual learning, and providing a platform for inclusive and multilateral dialogue amongst countries on an equal footing. So more precisely, the IFCMA brings together a diverse range of countries on an equal footing basis to take stock of mitigation policies and map them to their emissions base, estimate the impacts of mitigation policies on emissions, and explore methodologies for computing carbon intensity of goods and sectors. In doing so, it connects representatives from three key policy communities, so environment, tax, and structural economic policy, and by no means is it intended as a forum to rank country policies. So finally, let me conclude my presentation by touching upon some recent developments with implications for carbon pricing around the world. So if we move to the next slide, border carbon adjustments have been introduced or are being considered in many jurisdictions. So the EU CBAM is a price-based border carbon adjustment, which complements the EU ETS and came into force in October 2023 for a transitional phase until 2026. Starting in 2026, it will go hand in hand with a phase out of free allocation in CBAM covered sectors. The UK is also to introduce its own CBAM. Australia is conducting a review of carbon leakage, and several proposals for carbon adjustments have been put forward in the United States. So these carbon border adjustments could give an impetus for countries to introduce their own carbon pricing measures. As mentioned by Asia at the beginning as well, green industrial policies have been put forward in several jurisdictions, such as the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States or the EU Net Zero Industry Act. So subsidy-based mitigation approaches are meant to spur technological change, but at the same time, they come with large fiscal costs. So large subsidies could encourage positive technological spillovers, but the large fiscal costs also imply that many countries may not be able to follow suit in the case of a subsidy. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention, and I pass the floor back to my colleague, Asia Elguassi.
Thank you very much, Anasuya, for this very comprehensive presentation. As you see, there are many things going on that we have to keep track of. It's an exciting time in the carbon pricing world, and with various implications that need to be carefully studied, including on these border carbon adjustments that are being considered both in countries with carbon prices and in countries without carbon prices. So that's very interesting developments there, and also these subsidies that are cost-reducing measures that may perhaps also make the political case for carbon taxes a bit more, a bit stronger, but that is to be also seen. But before moving to our next speakers, I just want to take this moment to thank our donors without whom we wouldn't be able to expand our work to incorporate developing countries in the analysis that we undertake. So we're very, very grateful for their support in this area. And of course, if you have any follow-up questions or any details that on which you would like more clarity, don't hesitate to write to us. We'll be happy to hear from you. And now it is with a great honor to pass the floor to our colleague from the Asian Development Bank, Vivender.
Thank you very much, Asia. A very good afternoon, very good morning to colleagues joining from different parts of the world. My name is Virendra Duggal, and as it was mentioned earlier, that I lead ADB's work on carbon markets. Asia and Anasuya made fantastic presentations, highlighting a number of things, and which sets a very right platform for me to come in and share my 2 cents from Asia. First of all, I think it has been amply clarified that the carbon pricing is a very important instrument of the broader climate policy architecture, can help countries to reduce their GHG emissions cost effectively. I think this is a very important point to note because it provides countries the ability to choose least cost options, as Asia mentioned in her presentation. And as both Anasuya and Asia mentioned, that, carbon pricing instruments provide both the opportunities, both on the domestic resource mobilization and also for mobilizing international carbon finance. So, and it can help countries, policymakers to ease out some of the additional fiscal pressures that we are all familiar with, but at the same time provides incentives to overcome some of the well-known barriers. So I think this is a very important and very interesting stream of work that different countries are engaging, and which is duly reflected in the growing momentum that is under the ambit of carbon pricing, and this momentum is still growing. So could not agree more with you, Anasuya, saying that these are exciting times, and very happy to collaborate with partners like OECD and contribute to this growing stream of knowledge and practice of building carbon pricing within the countries in Asia and the Pacific as a part of their broader climate policy architecture. So I put together a few slides. Let me very quickly come in and mention that there are a number of carbon pricing instruments. They range from domestic emission trading systems to carbon taxation on the domestic resource mobilization and on the and also the for example international carbon market. So some of these instruments are quantity based, some are price based, some are hybrid instruments, and they are designed to the specific requirements of the countries. And I think I would like to highlight one point here is there is no correct instrument. It basically depends upon what the national circumstances are, what are the sectoral preferences and characteristics, and therefore what objectives we are trying to achieve. I think this is very important for countries to say, and this is what is normally we say that rather than debating about which instrument is right for a country, which instrument is right for a particular sector, it is very important how do you go about designing that particular instrument. I think this is very important. On the next slide, I would like to show you that, the growing momentum, the way from we see from our eyes in Asia and the Pacific, building on Anusia's point, more than 80% of the global GHG emissions are under the coverage of carbon pricing, and this is growing. But from the Asia and Pacific, we have 7 carbon pricing initiatives which are already implemented or announced at the national level. I think this is very important. Japan, Singapore, Kazakhstan, New Zealand, Korea, PRC. I think these are very important countries with a very wide industrial base of GHG emission. And Indonesia has started ETS for the coal power plants and is planning to implement carbon tax. Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, and Pakistan are also considering adopting carbon pricing instruments. So this contributes to the point that Asia and the Pacific is in sync with the global momentum for the use of carbon pricing in fight against climate change, as we say in the region. Okay, on the next slide, please. I'll quickly touch upon some of the points of on carbon pricing. Some of these points, the perspective from Asia and the Pacific. So one is a CBAM and the trade implications. So CBAM, as we commonly know, it aims to avoid the carbon leakage and encourage the partner countries to establish carbon pricing policies within their national jurisdictions. So in Asia, CBAM is likely to affect some of the countries more, some countries less. Some countries, like for Central and the West, have a relatively large exposure to the EU in the trade of goods covered by the mechanism, the CBAM. And most impacted countries from the initial analysis that we have done include India, especially in the iron and the steel sector, Georgia in the fertilizer sector, and Kazakhstan in the aluminum sector. So some countries more, some countries less, some sectors more, some sectors less. So this is the kind of analysis that we have. ADB has recently come out with a new publication on the CBAM. You can find more information on this topic, and we are very happy to engage, share more knowledge on this topic. On the next slide, there's another new reality on the carbon pricing from our eyes that we would like to share here is about the use of international market. And so I did mention about that. So international carbon markets, as I said, are a very important aspect of the broader climate policy architecture. Especially, it can help countries to reduce their GHG emissions cost effectively by offsetting some of the emissions in other places where it is with the benefit of lower marginal abatement cost. So international carbon markets, many of us are familiar with under the Kyoto Protocol, where we had the clean development mechanism. We are already familiar with the voluntary carbon markets. Now we have the growing momentum for the use of Article 6 under the Paris Agreement. And of course, the voluntary carbon markets are growing exponentially. So there are different streams of international carbon market. But the one thing which is common, international carbon markets can be very important conduit for the flow of international carbon finance, which can incentivize investments in low carbon technologies, as we say, can catalyze lots of investments and actually help us in unlocking billions of dollars worth of investment. Therefore, carbon markets can play a very, very important role in enhancing climate action. This on the next slide, this is very interesting, and this is kind of posing a lot of challenge for the policymakers, but this also adds to the point when we say the exciting time for carbon pricing, because the carbon markets are evolving. There are multiple going through exponential growth, but at the same time, the carbon markets are getting grown in all possible directions. So there's a fragmented market. There are multiple markets. Clear departure from the Kyoto to the volume of voluntary carbon markets at this point in time are much larger than the compliance market, as the rules for Article 6 are getting set. Of course, the things may change. But what's important is that these fragmented market that we talk about could occur in the international arena, could happen within the domestic market, as we talked about ETS. So there there could be different drivers as the common classification we do between the domestic market and the international market is where the demand is coming from. So where the demand is coming out of compliance, like for NDC or EU ETS as an example, or it is coming from voluntary action, net zero target for the company, or CSR for that matter. So there are different mechanisms which are coming under compliance and voluntary markets, so like Article 6 or VERA, gold standards, and there are different crediting mechanisms, emission trading systems covering different sectors. And there are a whole bunch of examples. So I think the carbon markets are getting are evolving, but at the same time they're quite fragmented. They may have different demand drivers. They may therefore have different expectations in terms of quality and therefore different price levels. So very interesting. And we understand this is a big challenge for the policymakers, and we have come out with a knowledge product on to how can policymaker wrap their head around this very important topic and try to work around their national strategies. And as I was saying earlier, the national strategies have to address the national objective, the national priorities, most importantly, the national circumstances. So in that context, it is very important that the policymakers have a full view of the entire landscape of policy instruments that are available to them, and then they pick and choose the instruments. And in that context, capacity building and enhancing their technical competence to make those informed choices is very important. So this is one of the areas of work that EDB is quite engaged into. Let's move on to the next slide. So we will share a link to this publication, which we think is going to be very useful for the policymakers. So the third thing, which is really very important for countries' engagement with carbon markets, is why do you want to engage with carbon markets? So there has to be a clear-cut strategy drawn for the countries, and that could, in this context, maybe in the Paris era, could come from the NDC achievement, as we may see on the top. So the countries can build different strategic elements to achieve the NDC targets, and therefore it's very important that they have clear objectives, and then that can lead to their engagement with Article 6. So once countries choose their engagement with Article 6 as a option that they have chosen carefully, and then there's an entire route to take. For example, building the strategy and how about to build about the national policy framework, national strategy, the institutional infrastructure, and the infrastructure that is required, especially for the avoidance of double counting. So complete pathway. But what's important, as I was saying earlier, is countries need to have a clear-cut assessment of what are their strategic objectives to achieve their climate targets as articulated by their NDCs. Let's come to the next slide, please. Okay, I'll just give a very quick introduction of what EDB is doing. We are engaged with carbon markets for a long period of time, and as a part of our work, we adopt a two-pronged strategy. On one side, we provide technical and capacity building for the policymakers and also the individual project developers. So in that context, we provide upstream, midstream, and downstream support to help our developing member countries in Asia and the Pacific, basically to enhance their ability to participate and take advantage of the market opportunities. Now, those market opportunities come from either compliance market like CDM in previous times, or the JCM, the Joint Trading Mechanism initiated by government of Japan, or the voluntary carbon markets, and now Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So our angle of being associated with the markets is we would like to support our developing member countries to access international carbon finance, to incentivize investment in low carbon technologies and enhance climate action in the region. So as a part of the second stream that we pursue, we establish carbon funds by working with our development partners, and through carbon funds, we mobilize carbon finance to individual projects by purchasing carbon credits. This is what we have done since Kyoto Protocol. We established one fund after the other, Asia Pacific Carbon Fund, backed with a Future Carbon Fund in the Kyoto Protocol second period. We are currently running Japan Fund for JCM, which is the only bilateral mechanism, and very recently we have launched first of its own kind fund under the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and we call it Climate Action Catalyst Fund. So when the Paris Agreement was established, EDB took charge of working with its countries to enhance their capacity, to enhance their readiness for Article 6 markets. And that's why we established Article 6 support facility. And through this Article 6 support facility, we are providing countries the support that they require to, for example, to build the national strategies I was talking about, developing the national framework or institutional infrastructure, conducting pilots, or most importantly, enhancing the capacity of the policy makers for them to consider all elements very carefully and make informed choices. I think this is very important. And the last slide on this slide deck is about the Climate Action Catalyst Fund that I mentioned about. So this carbon fund, as I was mentioning, is going to play a very important role in providing carbon finance to those transformative mitigation actions in Asia and the Pacific that will help countries not only in achieving their NDC target, but also raising the ambition. So we are working with a number of developing partners to get their interest into this carbon fund. And through this carbon fund, then we will be acquiring ITMOs, the new name for carbon credits under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And that's what is going to provide that additional source of funding, the catalyst for countries to unlock investments in low carbon technologies. So this is going to be a very, very important instrument, because one of the key factors of this element for us to establish the Climate Action Catalyst Fund is the uncertainty that the project developers or investors are facing is about whether or not they're going to get any carbon finance, whether there's going to be any market for the offset credit they're generating. If yes, what is going to be the price? So one of the key features of this carbon fund is it is going to assets provide price signal. This is very important, and so I did mention about providing the importance of providing price signal. So this carbon fund is going to provide price signal for carbon credits under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and to the individual project developers, it is going to provide certainty in terms of the future inflow of carbon finance through the sale of carbon credits. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for this opportunity to interact with all of you. I'll be very happy to take on any questions.
Thank you, Virender, very much for this presentation. I think it's very important for us to hear about the specificities of a region, of a country, and to see how these specific challenges are being addressed in more of a tailored manner. Yes, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the Tax and Development Day sessions. So thank you very much and have a good one. Bye. Thank you.